Hi, my name is Dr. Harvey Miller, and welcome to our next lecture in our operations management course. This particular lecture is going to focus on a topic called supply chain management. Now, this is a very interesting topic because all of us are impacted by a supply chain, and the supply chain was front and center during the height of the COVID pandemic. Why? Because there are still supply chains that have people forming an integral part of that supply chain. And because people were impacted, either you had a shortage of employees who either working in warehouses or shortage of truck drivers. That led to a major impact on the supply chain. So goods were not arriving on time as normally expected, as people, fell sick, or there were concerns about the spreading of the coronavirus. Then additional measures were put in place to sort of prevent spread. That led to slowdown in terms of different parts of the supply chain. So that basically increased lead time. It also impacted availability, right? Timeliness of deliveries, all those sorts of things, which ultimately, in a lot of cases, led to higher prices for products because product availability was being impacted by the fact that goods were not being shipped on time in right quantities, and so that definitely led to some major challenges in the supply chain. Not only that, there are downstream effects, because if you are a manufacturer and you require raw materials, but you don't get those raw materials on time, the products that you're manufacturing cannot be delivered now to your end customer. So because it's a supply chain, that means that there are many parts to it. Each part was actually impacting the other. And so as a result, we paid a price for it. Now, while it appears that COVID is still with us, but certainly we don't have the height of awareness and concerns that we had, in 2021, 22. And so, why haven't prices gone back down? Because the supplies have actually improved. That's an important question to ask. So let's talk a little bit about what is the supply chain, why is it so important, and the concept of a supply chain strategy. So depending on how your organization has framed its mission, and if it is a for-profit organization, how it wants to compete, the supply chain plays a major role in that. If it is a not-for-profit organization, you still have a mission that you want to accomplish. You still have performance priorities, and so those performance priorities can be impacted by the supply chain. In humanitarian disasters, logistics are critical. How do you get medicines to people in distress who need it? How do you get food to people who are in distress? And so you have to look at shipping via seagoing cargo vessels, or whether or not you're using trucks, or whether or not you're going to use air freight. And then in certain remote areas, sometimes you may have to use drones. So supply chain management is getting complicated. Logistics are getting sophisticated, and so managing all of that is really a challenge for your supply chain manager. So we're going to just try to understand a few things. Building a supply base, logistics management, distribution management, ethics, and sustainable supply chain management, and then measuring supply chain performance. We will talk a bit about those, right? So this is just an example, just to show you how important supply chain management is. There is a food chain in the U.S. called Red Lobster. So if you've ever gone there, you might have heard of the restaurant, and the world's largest seafood restaurant company. They serve 140 million meals annually from over 700 restaurants. A winning operation strategy requires a winning supply chain. So if you're going to have an effective operation strategy, and if you recall, what is an operation strategy? The operations strategy is how we configure the resources in the operation system to drive competitive performance or operational performance, or allow you to achieve your mission. All right, so Red Lobster is said to be committed to seafood sustainability, so that means hopefully that they're not purchasing undersized seafood, or they're basically compliant with various international laws that govern the ocean, and those sorts of things, right? And then also national laws that may govern the seafood industry. Sources food from 5 continents and thousands of suppliers. So imagine the level of coordination that has to happen to make that work effectively. And its supply chains incorporate supplier qualification, so you have to meet certain standards. Product tracking, you have to be able to know exactly where the product came from, so this is where blockchain technology can be very helpful. Independent audits, where people are looking at a supply chain and providing feedback. And then just-in-time delivery to the restaurants, because seafood is a perishable product. You can't have it sitting around too long, certainly if you want to serve fresh seafood. But then of course, if you're looking at frozen seafood, well, at least you have some shelf life. Nonetheless, you still want to get your products in a timely fashion. All right, so we have a number of learning objectives, and so explaining what the strategic importance of supply chains, identifying sourcing strategies, understanding opportunities and challenges in the supply chain, and so on. So we will go through the various topics and then cover these sort of learning objectives at the same time. So what is supply chain management? And why is it important in the context of organizations? So the objective of supply chain management is to structure the supply chain to maximize its competitive advantage and benefits to the ultimate consumer. Now, this definition clearly is focused on a commercial enterprise, but what if it's not a commercial enterprise? So in that case, it is really structuring the supply chain to deliver on the performance goals that the organization have, particularly when those performance goals have implications for the supply chain. So for example, if you want to deliver if you want to deliver fresh food to a remote community and so on, so you have to be able to have a fast supply chain that uses a transportation mechanism that allows you to meet the standards that you set. And so in a case like that, you would have to configure the appropriate supply chain where goods can be moved from the supplier to the consumer without having the need for storage, too much storage in between, right? Because otherwise it will no longer be fresh. So it all depends again on your performance objectives, and then you will have to configure your supply chain to be able to achieve that. All right. So here's an example of a supply chain for beer, all things. So if we know the hops come from the farm, so so you have the farm right here producing the whatever the grain is. Then you have the hops being sort of stored here and processed, and then you have the brewer getting the hops over here and then using that to produce the beer. The brewer now of course have other things that come in besides the hops. You have cans, and if you are vertically integrated, then you have a factory that makes the cans, and then bottles, if beer is also being sold in bottles. So these are different parts of the supply chain. Once the beer is actually produced, then of course it goes to a distributor, and then the distributor sends it out to a grocery store, and then the customer actually buys it. Okay, so that's kind of like the nuts and bolts of an example of a supply chain. And so imagine that you have to manage each phase. The farmers have to send the hops to a warehouse, And so at what rate are they sending the hops to this warehouse? Who determines that? So right here. And then of course the brewer has a demand, so the warehouse have to be sufficiently large to be able to manage the demand from the brewer. Okay, and then of course the farms that supply the warehouse have to also be sufficiently large. Not only do we have to look at the amount that you order, but when do you place the orders, negotiating prices, when do you want the orders to be delivered. So all these decisions have to be made at different stages. Why is supply chains important strategically? They are important because they can impact your mission and your vision, your ability to achieve. I mean, Walmart, I'm not trying to promote them, but their claim to fame is that they have a really efficient supply chain. So as a result, their supply chain is so well aligned that they don't have to play the game of having sales. So, most times when companies have sales, it's because they have excess inventory and they need to get rid of it. So, Walmart is supposedly so efficient with its supply chain that it does not have to have sales. So, what it does is offers what it calls, or its strategy is everyday low prices. So, its prices are kept low because of the efficiency in the supply chain, and it does not have to, offer sales to get rid of excess inventory because this inventory is actually fairly well matched. All right. So when you're configuring a supply chain, you got to think of the parts between the supplier and the consumer or the customer. And so there is the idea of demand management, where you have to understand the demand from your customers, and then that then gets communicated back through your supply chain to ensure that the various components of the supply chain can respond. And then of course you have to provide an enabling environment, which is here, right? So prepares, maintains, manages information for value-added activities. So a big chunk of what has to be communicated or shared in a supply chain is information about the demand, information about capacity, information about your logistics providers, and so on, the warehouses, the sizes, the location, all of that information, the current levels of inventory, the current prices, all of that information is critical and has to be communicated. So if we look at things going in this direction forward, so you have on the source side, identify, select, manage, and access various sources. And that's from your supplier base, right? Or potential suppliers. Then we're looking at make, source, make, and deliver. When you're making now, you're managing the production, execution of production, testing, packaging, and then deliver. Your invoices, your warehousing, your transportation system, right? And your install. So these are various parts of the forward supply chain, if you wish, right? We could you certainly can look at it that way. In terms of the reverse now, between your customer and your suppliers, there is this direction right here. We call that a reverse supply chain. So reverse supply chain because then it allows the customer to send a product back. In some cases, the product is just simply returned because the customer did not like it, or the product is damaged, or the product has reached the end of its useful life, and there is a policy of sort of taking products at the end of the useful life and processing it to kind of reclaim parts of it that can be reused, right? So reuse, recycle, reuse, right? I'm trying to remember the 3 R's now. Imagine that. Reduce, recycle, reuse. There you go. All right? So that's a reverse supply chain. So the strategic importance, here are a number of factors to consider that will kind of help to emphasize why supply chains are important. A large portion of sales dollars spent on purchases is actually due to the supply chain. So in other words, if you look at the cost of goods sold, a fair chunk of that cost of goods sold is actually supply chain related costs. Supply relationships increasingly integrated and long term. So the idea that when you're thinking about your relationships with suppliers, you should think about the long term benefit. And if you're thinking long term, then you have to think strategically. If you're going to enter into a long term relationship with a supplier, you want to make sure that supplier is going to be around, and then that supplier is totally capable of supplying you with what your needs are. All right. So that's extremely important. Other aspects of the supply chain: improve innovation, speed, design, and reduce costs. So when we're talking about innovation in terms of product innovation, service innovation, the supply chain plays an important role in that, because if you're going to innovate a product and you need raw materials, supply chain has to deliver that. If you're going to deliver that innovative product to customers, the supply chain has to deal with that. The speed of speed design is essentially how fast you can get the product to market. And if you are talking again about getting product to market, then you have to give consideration to your whole supply chain network that is going to make that happen. And then managing supplier relationships has now become even more important, because there was a time when simply, you got suppliers to compete with each other and just went for the lowest cost. However, there's a danger in doing that, because there's no loyalty that's built up between the organization and the supplier. So as a result, you find that there's a risk that you can end up losing a supplier because that relationship has been built. So it's not just all about the money, it's about the long-term relationships, and that's a strategic thing. You got to know who are you going to enter into a long-term relationship with, all right, if you're going to do so. So supply chain cost as a percentage of sales, this is just to give you an idea of the costs relative to sales. For automobiles, imagine that 67%, right, of your price is actually the supply chain costs. Beverages 52%, chemicals 62%, food 60%, lumber 61%, metal 65%, petroleum 79%. You pipe in that oil from one location to the next, and then an ocean tanker takes it and brings it to a distillery, and then from that distillery, it's just purely supply chain costs in a case like that. All right. So supply chain versus sales strategy. There's this idea that you could improve profitability by either focusing on reducing your supply chain costs, or you could try a marketing strategy that helps to boost your revenues. All right. And so here's an example to kind of show, and of course it all depends on what your numbers are. I wouldn't even say, while this example shows that focusing on the supply chain and trying to reduce the cost can lead to greater benefit, it may not always be the case. All right. Maybe there's an underserved market, and then that market could really drive your profitability much faster than lowering supply chain costs. Anyway, 60% of sales in the supply chain, gross profit is $10,000, increase profits to $15,000, 50%. So you're trying to increase profit. Do you do that by increasing sales, or do you do that by trying to lower your costs? So here's your current situation. Sales, 100,000, right? So 100,000. And then if you increase your sales, then you take it up to 125,000. In terms of the cost of goods sold is 60,000. Production cost 20, fixed cost 10, and profit 10. If you're focusing on the supply chain strategy, then if you try to find a way to lower costs instead, so you have cost of materials are now down to 55,000, so you're lowering that. Production cost remains the same, fixed costs remains the same, and then as a result, you could see a profit, an increase in profit, right? In terms of 15,000 in terms of the 10,000 that you had before. Okay. In terms of sales, your sales strategy, if you decide to go that route, then you could have sales of 125,000, but your cost of materials has now gone up, because remember, more volume that you sell, your material cost gone up. Your production cost also goes up because you are now producing more material, more products, and then your fixed cost remains the same. And in terms of your profit is 15,000, but the 15,000 relative to the 125,000 is 12%, compared to the 15,000 relative to the 100,000 is 15%. So the idea is that you could achieve significant better improvement in terms of your margins through a supply chain strategy as opposed to focusing on a sales strategy. Again, as I said, that depends on your numbers. We could fudge numbers to make it the sales strategy look better. But the main point to take away from that is that you can indeed have an effective supply chain strategy that could help you to lower your costs, right? Okay, so how corporate strategy impacts your supply chain decisions. So let's look at how the different types of strategies relate to that. So if you're focusing on a low-cost strategy, or response strategy, or differentiation strategy. So if you go back to our earlier chapter on operation strategy, you would have seen these three types of strategies, competitive strategies. In some cases, even not-for-profits, you could have a response strategy where you want to be quick to respond in humanitarian situations. And then low-cost strategy in terms of providing services to a particular constituency. You may very well want to provide that, whatever it is that you're providing at the lowest possible cost. Differentiation tends to be much more in terms of having competitors. So anyway, if we're talking about say cost, low cost strategy, then the primary supplier selection criteria would be cost. The response strategy would be based on capacity, speed, and flexibility, and your differentiation strategy will look at your ability to develop new products, willing to share information, and to work jointly and rapidly to develop these products. All right. So what you're seeing is that the selection criteria will be different depending on the strategy that you decide to select. Okay. If you're working on a low-cost strategy in terms of your supply chain inventory, then we're talking about minimizing your inventory-related costs. In terms of a response strategy, since you want to be able to respond whenever there is a need, you may want to hold buffer stocks, like some stocks just in case there is an unanticipated need that you could respond to it relatively quickly. All right. And then in terms of differentiation, you want to minimize your inventory because it could become obsolete. Think about it. If you're going to compete on differentiation and you're going to innovate your products, you don't want to have large volumes of your products sitting around. So you want to make sure that your product innovation is such that yes, you're producing new products on a regular basis, but that you do not have a whole bunch of product from the last innovation sitting around trying to be sold. All right, so it has to be timed in such a way that you have very little inventory left of what you innovated prior to the new introduction that you're trying to make. In terms of your distribution network, you could see that it's inexpensive. You try to sell through discount distributors, etc. In terms of a response strategy, you want it to be fast, provide a premium service, and then in terms of differentiation, you want to gather and communicate market research data. You want to have knowledgeable sales staff and so forth. All right. So I think you could read the rest of that for yourself. In terms of product design characteristics, you can see that you're focusing largely on cost. You want to maximize the performance but at a very low price. Then you want to look at, in terms of response time, you don't want to have a lot of non-productive time in your production facility. So you try to reduce your setup times, and then you try to do rapid production ramp up. So in other words, you could actually, if you have a brand new order that just came in, you need to be able to produce it. To be able to do so, it cannot take you a day or two or three to set up the equipment. You have to be able to set up the equipment very quickly. So therefore, you need fast setup times, low setup times. And then, of course, if you want to differentiate your product, if you focus on modular design, such as the Dell computer, Dell computer, not Dell computer, Dell introduced what we call mass customization. So mass customization allows you to differentiate yourself, but remember, mass customization is really predicated on what we call modular design, in which case you're just sort of swapping different parts and then you get a new product. So if it's a computer and you have a 1 terabyte drive computer and a 2 terabyte drive computer, if you swap out the hard drive in the same size slot, then you have two computers, right? If you have a 13-inch screen, 11-inch screen, a 15-inch screen, that's 3 types of screens. Multiplied by 2 sizes of hard drives, that's 2 times 3, that's 6 types of computers. So modular design helps you to get that very quickly. Let's talk a little bit about sourcing issues. What are some of the things that come up in terms of sourcing products in the supply chain? Well, one of them is a decision called make or buy. Sometimes a company has the ability to be able to make a product, but it's also considering whether or not it makes sense to actually outsource or to enter into an engagement with a contract manufacturer. So in that case, it has to do what you call a make or buy decision, and often that decision requires some financial analysis, assuming that the product quality requirements can be met by a potential supplier, and then also met if you decide to produce it internally. So choose between obtaining the product and services externally as opposed to producing them internally. The argument for outsourcing, this is basically make or buy, is really the outsourcing, kind of leads into outsourcing, is that you get efficiencies by focusing on what you're good at, right? So outsourcing now, which is kind of linked to that whole make or buy decision, because if you decide to buy, then that's kind of like, in a sense, that product that you need, you're outsourcing it to somebody else to produce it for you. It's one thing if you're just sourcing raw materials where you do not own the patent or whatever it is, the design. That's not what we're talking about. Outsourcing actually is when you have a particular product that you make, and there's a part of that or all of it that you decide to let somebody make for you. They're not selling it to other people, they're making it just for you. So transfer traditional internal activities and resources to outside vendors. Efficiency and specialization allows you to focus on your core competencies. A lot of companies outsource their payroll. They figure that's very routine, so let somebody else do the payroll, and they focus on talent management, right? Which is actually unique to the firm. But just processing somebody's pay, their pensions, leave requests and so on, they figure that there are indeed companies that actually provide these services on an outsourced basis. In terms of your sourcing strategies, a question that sometimes come up is the idea of whether or not you should have one supplier or multiple suppliers, right? And then whether or not you should vertically integrate or just kind of remain as you are, whether or not you should enter into joint ventures, participate in Kiretsu networks, or be a part of virtual companies. So let's just kind of understand these different types of strategies, and they have their advantages and disadvantages for different cases. All right. So many suppliers is actually useful when you have a product that's largely a commodity. So it means that just about everyone is making it, and they're making it reasonably well, so you don't have to worry. All right. So purchasing is usually based on price. Whoever has the cheapest cost, if you're buying potatoes, well, you may have some particular specs, but or just a product that is really just non-differentiated, right? If you buy water is non-differentiated unless you're talking about people who are adding things like fluoride or something else to the water. But if it is just purified water, there's not a lot of distinction between supplier A and supplier B in terms of the quality of the product, if they meet the appropriate set of standards. So in that case, it's a matter of price, and service is what you would go after. Suppliers compete with one another, and suppliers responsible for technology, expertise, forecasting, cost, quality, and delivery. So pretty much every aspect of that is controlled by your suppliers. Fewer suppliers now. Buyers from so this is a case where you have a much more differentiated type of product. You want to there's a reasonable level of dependency on your suppliers, and so you want to enter into long-term relationships. So rather than trying to enter into long-term relationships with a whole number of people, you can focus on long-term relationships with a few suppliers. So buyer from long-term relationships with few suppliers create value for economies of scale. By giving those fewer suppliers more business, you create economies of scale for them. Suppliers are more willing to participate in just-in-time programs because they will get the benefit of increased business from you, and the cost of changing suppliers is huge. Well, that's huge if you build a long-term relationship with a company. Trying to now change supplier and go and build that relationship for a new supplier is often difficult. Trade secrets and other alliances may be at risk. All right. So the idea is that when you're focusing on these few suppliers who have they usually have intimate knowledge of your operations, and that could put you in a risky situation. All right. Vertical integration, backward integration. There was a time when Apple computers used to be just sold by Apple, and then it decided that it was going to bring everything under the Apple brand. So there were not going to be any retailers selling Apple products. So this is a case where Apple decided to become its own producer, its warehouse, its distributor, right, and retailer. So that's vertical integration, and then so in other words, it owns all parts of that value chain. That's what we mean by vertical integration. There are advantages and disadvantages to that. So it all depends on the type of product that we're dealing with. If you actually purchase, say, a supplier, that's referred to as a backward integration. If you're a manufacturer that purchases a retailer, that's called forward integration. So forward integration this way, backward integration, and this is where the transformation is happening, right? So Pepsi purchasing bottling, Apple purchasing chip makers or retail stores, a pulp and paper company purchasing the pulp making, or tree harvesting, having the forest, owning the forest itself, or if it goes forward, end user paper conversion. So converting the paper to whatever is needed by different end users. It could decide it wants to own that as well. All right. So in terms of vertical integration, I think we understand what that is, and you would do that when it gives you advantage, some kind of either competitive advantage or it reduces the risk to your supply chain. It lowers the cost to your supply chain and so on. So there are many reasons why people actually go through that, and you can see here it could help to improve your costs, your quality, your delivery, your inventory, but often requires capital. Of course, if you're going to purchase a supplier, you're going to have capital. If you're going to purchase a retailer, you're going to have capital. And then it requires managerial skills that allow you to manage the different parts of that supply chain. It can be risky in the industries with rapid technological change. So if you now decide to actually purchase a manufacturer, say for example you're a distributor, and then you say, I'm going to buy the factory. If the technology changes very quickly, you better be here able to change with that technology, otherwise you will have nothing to distribute. Joint ventures, as the term suggests, is when you have a kind of formal collaboration between multiple partners, right? And then so it may enhance skills, secure your supply, and reduce your costs, because the members of the joint venture all have a vested interest. They all key stakeholders and investors in the network. QSU networks developed largely in Japan. The idea is that a company builds a relationship with a set of suppliers. It may even invest in them, or it might even have part ownership, and so it creates its own ecosystem, is what it is. Alright, suppliers become part of the company coalition, often provide financial support for the suppliers through ownership or loans. Members expect long-term relationships as a result, and provide technical expertise. Stable deliveries may extend through several levels of the supply chain. South Korean, you say that chaebols are similar, but more family-controlled networks. So QSO networks just basically allow for creating an ecosystem that you can rely on. Virtual companies is really when a group of companies come together to create. They do different things. A, B, C, D, and then they act as if they're one company. Right? So that's a virtual company. Okay, because they're not really a single corporation. So rely on a variety of partner relationships to provide service on demand, fluid organizational boundaries that allow for the creation of unique enterprises to meet changing market demands. So if all of a sudden there's a new market demand, and the four of these organizations that came together doesn't have that, they can invite another company to be part of that virtual organization. There are risks in the supply chain, as we know, and so we have to manage the risk in the supply chain. So if you have few suppliers, that increases your reliance on few people. If you have multiple suppliers, you might say, because you're competing on price, sometimes you may not necessarily get the best quality. All right. So risk in supply chains, basically increased dependence. If the more you rely on your supply chain, the greater the risk. You have global and logistical issues, you have wars, you have all kinds of crazy things happening. Vendor reliability and quality risks. So if the vendor is starting to slack off and not producing products according to your specs, then there's political and currency risks. So currencies can fluctuate. Of course, accidents can happen as well, right? So for each of these cases, for the different types of risks, some may be within the company's control, some may not be, and so therefore there is a need to figure out how to bring about some kind of control to those risks. All right. So what can you do? You could do research. You could do some kind of planning, innovative planning, reduce potential disruptions. Basically, do sort of scenario analysis, and then develop contingencies, prepare responses to negative events. Be flexible, secure your supply chains as well, and diversify your supplier base, meaning that you want to be able to hedge against uncertainty. So these are some of the things to think about. All right. So there are other types of risks, and then some of the tactics are actually written here. I won't go through all of them, but as you could see, failure to deliver is a particular supply chain risk. Supplier quality failures. So how do you handle those? So using multiple suppliers can help you with failure to deliver. If one supplier is slacking, then you move some of the business to another supplier that could actually do it. In terms of your quality failures, careful supplier selection, training, certification, and monitoring. So you have to have a really good system of monitoring input quality, so that way you don't get a bunch of bad products being shipped to your organization. All right. So let's see what some of these folks have done in terms of supplier failure to deliver. McDonald's planned its supply chain 6 years before opening in Russia. Every plant, bakery, meat, chicken, fish, lettuce is closely monitored, right, to ensure strong links. Darden Restaurants has placed extensive controls, including third-party audits, on supplier processes and logistics to ensure constant monitoring and the reduction of risk. And of course, that will help to improve the consistency of the quality and lead time performance and so on. Outsourcing is another one. And when you allow somebody to take over a process that you could do yourself, you can put yourself at risk of your intellectual property being used by another organization. So you have to be very careful that you outsource things that are low value. All right. Logistics delays or damage. We all have gotten some kind of product that we've either ordered or purchased, only to reach home and realize that the product is damaged. All right. Again, the distribution risk and information loss or distortion of information, where if you don't have really good information systems, the data in your information system can be inaccurate, then causing you to make decisions not based on accurate information that have cost implications as well. All right. If you're going to look at the distribution aspects, you want to make sure that you select your distributors carefully, and have effective contracts from managing the relationships, and then at the same time imposing penalties on suppliers that fail to meet those requirements. Political risk, economic risk, and natural catastrophes, a very important one. You could reduce your risk by taking insurance, alternate sourcing, and cross-country diversification. What that means, particularly in terms of not insurance, but alternate sourcing. So if you are operating in North America, or let's say in a particular region, and you might say, okay, this is a region that usually has tornadoes, or hurricanes. So why don't we, if we only had a single supplier in a hurricane belt, chances are if that area gets hit by a hurricane, that you're in trouble. So you want to diversify your suppliers so that you could then get the supply from somewhere else. So having alternate sources can be very useful. All right. So you can see here, Toyota, after its experience with fires, earthquakes, and tsunamis, now attempts to have at least 2 suppliers in a different geographical region for each component in its manufacturing. 2 suppliers per component. All right. And theft, vandalism, and terrorism, you could kind of use a whole bunch of security things. Security and just-in-time are also part of supply chain management. And so what can happen? What can go wrong? Shipments can get misrouted, stolen, damaged, excessively delayed. You have technical innovations, improving security and inventory management, helping to improve the security of goods, and so particularly at cargo ports. So location, motion sensors, broken seals, temperature, radioactivity, and then tracking can help to expedite shipments, but also to locate them as well. Right. In terms of managing an integrated supply chain, there are challenges and opportunities. Let's talk a little bit about some of the issues. very quickly. Now, when we say an integrated supply chain, what do we mean? It means that you are talking about your retailer, warehousing, maybe manufacturing, and then this is like your suppliers, right? You may have multiple suppliers, and so on. So this entire supply chain is integrated. So when we talk about integration, it means that there's information sharing that happens between these folks, right? So what are some of the issues? Well, there's an issue called local optimization. That means that each person in the supply chain is acting in their own best interest. All right, so that could actually cause problems because somebody's decision can influence another component in the supply chain. That decision is made based on the actions of that downstream person or even the upstream person, only to realize later on that there were some inaccuracies. Excuse me. Incentives. Sometimes manufacturers might offer incentives, and if they offer incentives to purchase more, then say the distributor could end up with large volumes of inventory, which then turns around and says, "Ooh, I'm not moving this fast enough. I got it at a good price, but the reality is that I did not match the orders to the demands. I matched the orders to the price." So I would say, "Well, let me take advantage of this," only to find out that you now have large stockpiles of inventory. So what do? You have a sale. When you have a sale, all of a sudden that sale triggers a whole mass buying, and then you get a distorted view of what the demand for the product really is, because the sale stimulated demand. So you have to be careful about how that really disrupts the supply chain. Producing in large lots, sometimes we produce in large lots to reduce costs, but then it could actually, in terms of getting economies of scale, but it could increase our inventory holding costs as a result. All right. Opportunities. So what are some of the opportunities? Well, if the supply chain is integrated, you may be able to have what you call pull data. So before I manufacture, I'm going to look at what my supplier is doing and pull information from my supplier. And then, or pull information from the distribution center or the retailer. By being able to get more accurate information, then it allows you to do better planning. Lot size reduction. If you have accurate demand information, you could focus on right sizing your lot sizes or your batch sizes in production to reduce your costs. So you're not driven by just pricing, but by the actual information that you have, and you'll optimize for that purpose. Single stage control of inventory replenishment. What does that mean? Well, it means that if you have an integrated supply chain, if you own all of the parts of that supply chain, the retail store, the distribution center, the manufacturer, and then the suppliers and so on, what could happen is that you could act from the retail standpoint, look at the entire supply chain, and then manage and control the entire supply chain from that single vantage point. Why? Because you have line of sight. You're able to see what's going on in all the various parts, and then you can manage it from that single stage. All right? So a single supply chain member is responsible for placing the orders across all of the parts of that supply chain. And then vendor managed inventory. This is a technique where retailers don't want to take the risk associated with having stock that is not sold. So they basically provide space to a vendor and say, hey, you manage the inventory in that space. So if you've gone to stores, local stores like your supermarkets, your home and building supplies, you will find that there are people there who are stocking shelves that are not employees of that company. And that's because the vendor is managing the inventory level, coming in on a routine basis to see what sold, what didn't sell, and then doing replenishment. So that work is taken away from the company, and the risk is also taken away from the company. So these are special relationships. Sorry. Collaborative planning, forecasting, and replenishment, CPFR, essentially by having line of sight across the supply chain, then you have the ability to do better coordination and better collaboration to forecast the demand across the chain and then to manage replenishment of goods and services. Blanket orders is something that's useful, that gives, say, a manufacturer or a supplier a good piece of information to work with. So if I said to you, I'm going to order 1,000 units this year, and we commit to that, and we enter into an agreement, then you could manage your production for that 1,000 units. All I have to do now as a purchaser is to draw down on that 1,000. Okay, send me 100 units now. Send me 80 units. Send me 500 units. And so in that case, we find that you sort of collaborate. You have this blanket orders that's being drawn down as needed. Standardization helps to lower cost, and then postponement withholds modification as long as possible. Rather than, imagine if you wanted to get every kind of color, paint color. You don't have a warehouse big enough to store that, but instead you have the base and you tint the bases. So you keep inventory of tints, and the base, you just sell the base, and then people then get the color they want through a tinting formula that gives them exactly what they're looking for. So that's called postponement. So when you go to buy paint and you have the attendant actually tinting the paint for you based on your swatch your color swatch that you selected, that is postponement. They're postponing the color until you actually place the order, and that helps to lower costs. Other things that we could do electronic ordering, have an omni-channel strategy. That means that your products are available from multiple channels. Use drop shipping. Drop shipping actually bypasses the actual retailer. What it does, or the seller, right? So if I'm running a business, I have a supplier, and then you purchase from me, the supplier does not send the product to me to send to you. The supplier drops it right at your doorstep, and that's called drop shipping, right? And then blockchain aids tracking and verification. Digitalization and the Internet of Things improves visibility, enabling managers to make decisions in real time based on accurate and current data. So if you have digital processes that you could collect data in real time, it really allows you to manage the supply chain better, right? So this is just an example of tracing food via blockchain, and you can see that there's a hatchery, right? And you collect information from the hatchery, the producer, then you've the name of the livestock, the livestock farm, the rearing date qualifies as GMO free, red antibiotics free, red out in the open, departure date to the slaughterhouse, and then the processor, the slaughter location. So usually you could trace where something came from if you have the blockchain sort of data set up that captures the product at all of its various stages. All right. In terms of building a supplier base, one of the things we're going to have to do is to evaluate your suppliers, and as part of that evaluation, you can certify them. You can certify them and say this company is qualified to supply us. So you will have to find potential suppliers, determine the likelihood of them becoming good suppliers, and then go through a certification process where you look at their education, certification, qualification, and so on, past performance. Sometimes you engage in supplier development where you want to build a long-term relationship. You have the capital resources to invest in that company, so you may very well work on building capabilities. So supplier development, what you do is you're integrating the supplier into your production system. And when you do so, you will focus on ensuring that they can meet your quality requirements. They understand your product specs. They know what your production schedules are, your delivery schedules. They understand your procurement policies. They undergo training. They work with the engineering department and can get help if they need to. And then that you have an agreement on how information is shared and transferred. Right? As part of your building your supplier base, you're going to have to negotiate. You're going to have to negotiate an agreement with a supplier. And so you could do so on the basis of a cost-based price model, which is the supplier says, okay, if we're going to go on a cost-based pricing model, I need to know your costs. But to know your costs, you need to be transparent. So show me what your costs are. So the supplier opens their books. Market-based price model, where it's best based on prices that the supplier actually publishes and say, hey, I'm selling product X at X amount of dollars. Sometimes it can be done in terms of an auction, right, or index prices. And then competitive bidding, common policy for many purchasers where you get people to just bid, and then you look at their pricing, their capabilities, and a number of other criteria and make a decision. So in this case, this does not foster long-term relationships if every time you want someone, you actually engage in a competitive bidding process. In terms of building your supply base, you're going to have to engage with contracting, and then you want to look at the risk, the benefits, and then you want to have incentives for good performance. Centralized purchasing is also possible, where through the use of centralized purchasing, you could actually get a number of benefits such as leveraging volume to get economies of scale. You develop a specialized staff, and then that's their job is actually purchasing and procurement, or just managing the supply chain. You could develop supplier relationships with that group, maintain professional control of the performance of that supply chain, and so on. Reduce duplication of tasks and promote standardization. So there are a number of things that could come out of centralizing the supply chain management function, all right? And then last but not least, we could also consider electronic procurement. That means that we use electronic means to manage the sort of purchasing of materials, whether it's finished goods or components and so on. So it does speed up purchasing, it reduces costs and integrates the supply chain, because if you're doing things electronically, sometimes the databases talk to each other. The database in one firm talks to the database in another firm, and you reduce the amount of paperwork necessary to communicate what your needs are. So in a case like that, it's usually faster. All right. You could also have online catalogs and exchanges, and then you could also have online auctions as well, where companies put their products for sale at a particular price, and potential companies, looking for those products could actually bid on them, and so that happens. But there's also the concept of a reverse auction, where a reverse auction is when the highest price is put that the company is willing to pay is put forth, and then companies actually try to bid lower and lower and lower until you get to the lowest price, and that's the company that will be selected. So that's a reverse auction. Whereas in most auctions the price go up, in this auction the price actually goes down. All right. So that's our first segment in terms of introducing supply chains, and we will continue with part B when we talk a bit more about things such as ethics and sustainability. Okay.